A poem, one of my favorite poems by a man named William Stafford, and it finishes this way. For it is important that awake people be awake. For a breaking line may discourage them back to sleep. The signals we give, yes or no or maybe, should be clear. The darkness around us is deep. I've been thinking this week about what it means, or when people say, everything happens for a reason. Because it's such an interesting phrase, that last word in it, reason, it has so much mystery in it. It's almost like when you say everything happens for a reason, there should be a second sentence that follows, and we don't know what that reason is. Right? It seems to follow that way. It seems to me that this phrase, though, is only used in certain cases, and it's not always used. And for me, we're asking these big questions through January, not so much to get pat answers, right, but in hopes of going into them that we might follow closer to Jesus. That's always the hope here. Not that we're going to have all the answers, but that we're going to follow closer to Jesus, that we're going to have better discipleship. So I was thinking about this poem. And well, first I gotta get the sermon in hand. I was thinking about these words, and it seems to me it means more if we think about where they're said rather than what's said in them. Maybe we think about where they're not said. Everything happens for a reason. Have you ever seen anyone have something really good happen to them and they said, well, we're glad everything happens for a reason? I got pictures this morning of the sun coming up. If you were on Facebook, you may have seen these. It was fantastic. Has anyone, when the sun has come up, or when the rains have fallen, or the birds have welcomed the sun, and they've gone, thanks that everything happens for a reason? That phrase never shows up there, does it? And what it tells me is that we actually do expect good things to happen. We actually do expect grace to happen in this world, because it goes unsaid. And we do believe that good things are going to happen. We expect them. At least that's what I draw from, not when we hear that it's not said in these times. A place that you might hear it said is when we really want something. You know, like, you really want something and you want to find a reason to have that everything happens for a reason. I was thinking about this yesterday. Well, let's just assume that I really want a new car. You with me? I mean, you've seen my 4Runner, it's kind of beat up a little bit. I want a new car. And yesterday, so I'm watching all the sports. I'm sorry, Duke fans. I'm sorry, Green Bay fans. There was a lot of good sports on yesterday. But say I've been wanting this new car, and right after Peyton Manning throws that horrendous pass in double overtime. Come on, you're with me. You saw this yesterday. Say after that I start thinking about this car I want. And then all of a sudden, that GM commercial comes on. Oh, hey, everything happens for a reason. This must be a sign. We're reading this book, The Will of God, and the study that's going along with this series. And James Howe, the author, he calls this the hunch method. That we have hunches, and we typically, things that we really want, we will use God's name to get them. It's true, isn't it? We'll do it all the time. Well, I find it to be true in my life. The hunch method. That really I want something so bad that I'm going to say everything happens for a reason so I can have it. This is why it's important for awake people to be awake, isn't it? I mean, are we aware of these things that we use, our ploys to get what we want? But maybe God's had other plans for us. You never hear someone say everything happens for a reason when someone who's hungry comes up and asks for food. Hey. How come that isn't our hunch? You see? Poor arbiters of these things. Everything happens for a reason. Using the signs. It's important that awake people be awake. The hunch method, I hear it sometimes in that phrase that God opened that door up for me. That's true, God opens up doors for us all the time and places for us to walk through. But it seems the doors that, when everything happens for a reason, the doors that I want open are the easiest to walk through, right? The ones that are greased paths that I can slide down with lots of ease. Yeah, those are the ones where everything's happened for a reason. You see what I'm getting at here? Now, the time that we do hear everything happens for a reason, there's really one place that happens, right? It's in the moments of deep tragedy. It's when something really bad happens. And now what I believe in going through this is that when people say everything happens for a reason, really what they mean, and this is, and I believe this in all honesty, what they mean is that God's grace is still coming into this world, even in places of great strife. God's grace is trying to come through. That's what people mean when they say it. At least that's what I believe them to mean. But there's sometimes, I think, when we use this language, that it could do harm. I come back to that Stafford poem. The words that we use should be clear, otherwise a dividing line could separate us. And there's sometimes the words we use could actually do harm when we mean them to do good. We mean to comfort, and yet they might do harm. We end up doing the exact opposite thing we intended to do. So the words we use should be clear because the darkness around us is deep, isn't it? The rest of the sermon, I want to tell you a story about a really close friend of mine. I was blessed to be friends with a man named Nathan Griff Lyerly. We call him Griff. It's just a great name. Griff was one of three siblings. His brother Chris, and his sister Katerina. They were the first successful in vitro fertilization triplets in North Carolina. It was huge news in North Carolina. Griff grew up to be this man among boys too. He was like 6'2", and he was over 200 pounds, and he had these sharp blue eyes, and had this long blonde curly hair. You never wanted to stand next to Griff because the girls always noticed Griff, and they never noticed you. But at the same time, you wanted to stand next to Griff because he was the kind of person that made you a better person by being beside him. This was the Griff Lyerly I got to know. My senior year of college, it was late winter, I got a call from a friend, and his voice was trembling on the other end of the phone. And he said, Griff's been in a boat accident, and he didn't make it. And I remember going home. I went to Davidson College. It's 5 minutes down the road to go back to Mooresville. Not a big jump. But I remember going home and being with my best friends, and we were just, we knew the psalmist, we knew his words, those sorrows like sea billows, they just rolled over us, didn't they? And I remember being in the First Baptist Church in Mooresville. And it could have been First Methodist. It could have been here. And sitting in the pew beside my really good friend Wesley Gibson, and him saying over and over again, he was the best of us. He just kept saying that he was the best of us. And it was very clear that we weren't just grieving for the loss of Griff. We were grieving for all the goodness in this world that doesn't make it. All the good ones, you know? He was the best of us. And it was about this time, too, that people who really meant well, and they were there for comfort, and because it was such a hard situation, they began to say, everything happens for a reason. And I understand that now what they meant was that God's grace is still to be found here. That's what they meant. But I was so angry. Because what they were saying, whether they realized it or not, was that this was God's will to take Griff. At least that's how I heard it. And that's how his mother heard it. And I was so angry. You mean to come and do comfort, and yet you're saying this is God's will to take the best of us. And I had to wrestle with this for a long time. And I finally got into a place where I say, no, that was not God's will. It is not God's will to turn over boats and take the best of us. You know what took Griff? 55-degree waters, and the fact that he only had about 5% body fat or less. The fact that they had 6 volunteer firemen, or just 6 boys on an 18-foot catamaran, and there were 30-mile-per-hour wind gusts and 2 to 3 foot waves that took it over. That's what took Griff. Sometimes there are accidents in this world that are not God's will. Sometimes we, fragile humans, we are like dust of creation. We are that, and we get caught in places that are not God's will, and it happens. There are accidents. And I've been thinking about, what do we do in these moments? And what do we do with these fragile moments? And it seems to me those words from Romans do it perfectly. That you rejoice with those who rejoice, and you weep with those who weep. You become a vessel of God's love, and sometimes you say no words, but your presence is what you give. Because it seems to me now, like saying everything happens for a reason, and we may not be aware of this, but in some way it distances us from those who need comfort the most. Saying everything happens for a reason somehow puts up a dividing line, as Statford says, and extends the darkness deeper for those who need some comfort. And somehow it sends them more into what the psalmist said, my tears are thy food by day and by night, and people say, where is your God? Now it seems to me, to get this right, as we want to follow closer to Jesus, is to rejoice with those who rejoice, and to weep with those who weep. And that's where we're going to find God in those moments. And that's really the question, isn't it? It's not whether everything happens for a reason. If I've looked back, Jesus really isn't concerned with that question. He's more concerned with where we find God in those moments. Where is God's grace to be down in those moments? That's the real question, isn't it? That's what we want to know. And the thing is that I see, we want to know that God is deeply present. We want to know that God's heart is there. And this is the answer I've come up with now, as best as I can get, is that God's heart was the first to break when those cold waters surrounded Griff's body. That if God is love, God was immersed in that suffering with Griff and with us when we go through these moments. Beginning of the week, this was really difficult for me to get down on paper, and I had to call Griff's mom. And we hadn't spoken in about 6 years. And this was one of the most healing conversations that I had in a while. We spoke for about 30 minutes. And we talked about what it was like in the days that passed after Griff was taken from us. And yes, we can rejoice that Griff is with God now. I do believe that mercy is there, and it's with those little ones from Newtown, and with all the innocent that is taken in this world. Yes, from God we come, and to God we go. I believe that with all my heart, and that gives me hope. But what Griff's mom and I talked about, she would talk about how even in the days after Griff's passing, in the months afterwards, she would go out to her car and shut the door, and she would just yell with everything she has. And she told me later, this is great, she said, hey, God can take it, God's a big boy. But what I believe with all my heart now is that when we have those yells of this is not fair, when we have those cries for why in the world, I've come to believe this now, those are not simply our words, but those are God's Spirit pouring through us for all the brokenness in this world. Because God's love is so deep, his heart breaks for these things. And somehow in those moments we just become channels for that sacred cry in the night. And here's the thing. Somehow the mystery of it in those moments, we discover that the worst thing is never the last thing. And this is the truth. It's because God's great love transmits strength. It transmits courage into our lives. That somewhere in the midst of your pain, maybe it's just like a shadow of a spark, that something lights up in you and in a community that's trying to hold itself together, and you go, oh, That's what hope feels like. And you know what? I'm so glad the choir sang it, because, that's what it is to fall on your knees and you cry holy in those moments, because that's what we come here to worship. We come here to worship that God who comes to us in those moments, small bit of flickering hope in the midst of pain. That's what we're here for. That's the point. And at the end of the day, the darkness around us is deep, isn't it? I believe with all my heart that God's love, that depth is far more than the darkness. That by being vessels for this grace in the world, by weeping with those who weep, rejoicing with those who rejoice, we experience that God that we want to cry holy to cry glory to. God's love might pour through us, and maybe even through our tears, that they land on fertile ground, and that's where hope begins. Because at the end of the day, this is a love that will not let us go. Not now, not ever. We won't let go of Griff, or the best of us, or the best that's within us, or you.